Imagine opening your dorm room door after a grueling, entirely unnecessary 3-hour macroeconomics lecture, only to find a perfectly formatted, color-coded Excel spreadsheet taped to your desk. Not a syllabus, not a study guide, a fake dating contract. Living with Julian Brooks was already a daily trial. He was the golden boy of our East Coast university, an enigma with a capital E. He had the kind of sharp, suffocatingly handsome face that made omegas and betas alike trip over their own feet in the courtyard. And his scent. It was a maddening mix of crisp pine and something molten, like a forest fire just begging to consume you. Naturally, I hated it. I am Asher Hayes. My life philosophy is incredibly simple: expend minimal energy, breathe only when absolutely necessary, and avoid drama at all costs. But living with Julian meant my dorm hallway was constantly clogged with his romantic collateral damage. Just yesterday, Tracy, a stunning omega with an aggressively sweet floral perfume, stood outside our door for a full hour, crying loudly about how Julian was emotionally unavailable and too mysterious. It was exhausting just listening to her through the thin wood. So, when Julian walked into our room that Tuesday afternoon, looking like he had just stepped off a high-fashion runway in his tailored black winter coat, I didn't expect him to confidently slide his sleek laptop directly onto my lap. "What is this?" I grumbled, barely lifting my eyes from my phone. I was right in the middle of a very intense, highly demanding session of staring at the ceiling and doing absolutely nothing. "A solution," Julian said. His voice was that low, gravelly baritone that usually made half the student body melt into puddles. I just found it annoying because it usually meant he wanted something. To the Tracy problem, and the Jessica problem, and the entire Delta Kappa frat problem that keeps following me around campus. I finally looked down at the screen. My eyes widened in sheer disbelief. It was a spreadsheet, titled The Fake Dating Itinerary, Rules and Regulations. It had neat, color-coordinated columns for dates, times, locations, and extremely specific levels of physical contact. "You want me to be your fake boyfriend?" I scoffed loudly, pushing the laptop away as if it were radioactive. "Julian, I get exhausted just watching you exist. Why on earth would I want to pretend to date you? My hourly rate for putting up with your massive enigma ego is way out of your budget." Julian didn't blink. He just reached over, his scent spiking for a brief, overwhelming second, hot, heavy, and authoritative, before he tapped a specific cell on the glowing screen. "Section 4, Clause B," he read calmly, completely unbothered by my sarcasm. "If you agree to this arrangement, I will take over 100% of the dorm chores. I will cook all 3 meals every day. I will do the grocery shopping. You won't have to lift a single finger, Asher." I paused. My deep-seated salted fish instincts perked up immediately. No cooking. No walking outside in the freezing snow to buy cheap ramen. No doing the dishes. "But," Julian continued, his dark eyes locking onto mine, a dangerous, calculating glint flashing in them. "If you agree, you must strictly comply with the public displays of affection outlined in the schedule. If you refuse, kinship, pull away, or break character in front of an audience, the penalty clause automatically activates." He scrolled down. My jaw practically unhinged. "The penalty for breach of contract read, Asher Hayes will be solely responsible for doing all laundry, scrubbing the toilet, and taking out the trash for 30 consecutive days." "You're an actual psychopath," I muttered, genuinely horrified. "Who puts toilet scrubbing in a dating contract? Are you a serial killer in your spare time?" "Do we have a deal, Asher?" he asked, leaning in just a fraction. The sudden proximity sent a weird, electric jolt down my spine. The warmth radiating off his body was distracting, but I violently suppressed the omega instinct that wanted to lean into it. I looked at the cursed spreadsheet, then I slowly turned my head to look at the massive, threatening pile of dirty laundry I had been avoiding for 2 solid weeks in the corner of the room. "Fine," I spat out, glaring at him. "But if your hand lingers on my waist for more than the allotted 5 seconds, I am charging you extra fees, cash only." A tiny, almost imperceptible smirk tugged at the corner of Julian's mouth. Noted. By midnight, the dorm was pitch black and perfectly silent. The only sound in the room was the soft, rhythmic clicking of my mechanical keyboard. What Julian Brooks didn't know, and would absolutely never know, was that I wasn't just a lazy college student sleeping his life away. I was the anonymous author behind one of the hottest serialized web novels on the internet. And right now, my creative juices were fueled by unadulterated spite. I aggressively typed out the newest chapter, my villain. A tyrannical, Obsessive control freak enigma who forced the poor defenseless genius protagonist into signing a ridiculous, magical blood contract. The enigma's icy glare was nothing compared to his twisted, deeply perverted mind. I muttered under my breath as I typed, grinning wickedly in the blue glow of my screen. Take that, Brooks. Let's see how much people love you when you're a cartoonish villain. Across the room, Julian shifted beneath his blankets. I froze, holding my breath like a deer caught in headlights. He was propped up against his pillows, his phone illuminating his incredibly sharp jawline. He wasn't asleep, in fact. He looked deeply engrossed in whatever he was reading on his screen. A second later, a loud ping echoed in my headphones. A notification popped up on my author dashboard. User AlphaSlayer99 has just tipped you $200. The attached message read, "The villain is misunderstood. He clearly just wants the protagonist's attention. Keep up the excellent work, author." I rolled my eyes so hard they almost got stuck, quietly scoffing in the dark. AlphaSlayer99 was my #1, most dedicated fan. He always threw ridiculous amounts of money at me, but he had terrible taste. He was constantly defending the worst, most toxic characters I wrote. I quickly typed a polite reply thanking him for the massive donation, completely and utterly unaware that the very enigma I was currently roasting into oblivion in my story was lying barely 10 feet away from me, smirking quietly at his phone screen while literally paying my rent. Day 1 of the fake dating itinerary felt less like a romantic comedy and more like a highly coordinated hostage situation. According to Julian's cursed spreadsheet, our first public display of affection was scheduled for exactly 12:15 p.m. at the crowded campus cafeteria. I dragged my feet the entire way there, clutching my lunch tray like a shield. The moment we stepped into the dining hall, the usual chaotic chatter died down by at least 50%. I could feel the burning glares of a dozen omegas and betas boring into the side of my head. Julian naturally looked completely unbothered. He navigated the crowd with the effortless grace of a predator, his dark enigma aura practically parting the sea of students. He stopped at a table right in the middle of the room, maximum visibility obviously, and sat down. I flopped into the chair beside him, violently stabbing a baby carrot with my plastic fork. "Time," Julian murmured, his voice so low it vibrated directly against my collarbone. Before I could ask what he meant, his large, ridiculously warm hand slid around my waist. He pulled me flush against his side. The sudden impact knocked the breath right out of my lungs. His scent, that intoxicating, infuriating mix of burning pine and molten amber, wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. Every instinct of my lazy, omega biology screamed at me to melt into the touch. I aggressively forced myself to stiffen like a wooden board instead. 4 seconds, I whispered through a strained, entirely fake smile, glaring at the wall. "And your hand is too hot, move it." "It has only been 2 seconds, Asher," Julian replied smoothly, his thumb casually brushing against the fabric of my hoodie. A shiver betrayed me, shooting straight down my spine. "Don't rush the contract, unless you've suddenly developed a deep, passionate longing for toilet bowl cleaner." I bit my tongue so hard I almost tasted blood. I mentally counted down from 5. The second I hit 0, I violently shimmied away from him, scooting my chair an inch to the left. "Pleasure doing business with you," I hissed, shoving the carrot into my mouth. Julian didn't look annoyed, if anything. There was a faint, amused glint in his dark eyes as he elegantly picked up his coffee cup. "We have the library at 3:00 p.m. Section 2, Clause C, hand-holding while studying. Don't be late." I groaned, burying my face in my hands. I was going to die of exhaustion before the semester even ended. By the time 11:00 p.m. rolled around, I was mentally and physically drained. Pretending to be in love with a walking ice sculpture who operated on Microsoft Office software was exhausting. I was sprawled across my bed on my stomach, my laptop glowing in the dark room. Across the space, Julian was reading a massive, intimidating textbook, looking like a ridiculously handsome stock photo for Ivy League excellence. I ignored him, opening my author dashboard. The new chapter of my web novel was gaining massive traction, mostly because people loved hating the villain I had based entirely on Julian. But before I started writing, I opened my private messages. My top donator, AlphaSlayer99, was online. We usually chatted about plot outlines, but tonight, I desperately needed to vent. I sent a message to author Asher. "My life is a nightmare. I am living with a robot." He scheduled my entire existence into a spreadsheet. I feel like a Tamagotchi being kept alive purely out of spite. I waited. A few feet away, I heard the faint tap-tap of Julian typing on his phone. A second later, a reply popped up on my screen. The message from Alpha Slayer 99 read, a spreadsheet. That sounds incredibly efficient. Perhaps your roommate is just methodical. Predictability can be a very grounding form of care. Have you considered looking at it from his perspective? I scowled at the screen, aggressively mashing my fingers against the keyboard. I replied, whose side are you on? He threatened to make me scrub the bathroom if I didn't let him hold my hand in the library today. He's a tyrant, a very warm, very annoying tyrant with stupidly good hair. Across the room, Julian suddenly coughed. It sounded suspiciously like he was choking on his own saliva. I glanced over, but he was holding his textbook slightly higher, completely hiding his face. My screen pinged again. Alpha Slayer 99 answered. At least you admit he has good hair. Try not to stress too much, also. Posture is highly important when you write. Sit up straight, author. You will ruin your spine laying like that. I blinked. Without thinking, I shifted on my bed, propping myself up on my elbows and straightening my back. It was weirdly specific advice, but Alpha Slayer 99 had always acted like a weird, overprotective cyber dad. I typed a quick goodnight and closed the laptop, letting my heavy eyelids shut. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I had been run over by a truck. Sleeping on my stomach while angrily typing had done absolutely zero favors for my lower back. I groaned out loud, shuffling toward the small kitchen area in my oversized pajamas, aggressively rubbing the back of my neck. Julian was already awake, dressed in a crisp white shirt, calmly flipping pancakes at the stove. Without even looking at me, he reached over and slid a perfectly brewed cup of coffee across the counter. Thanks, I mumbled groggily, grabbing the mug and leaning heavily against the counter, curving my spine like a cooked shrimp. Julian glanced at me, his dark eyes scanning my hunched form. He reached out, tapping 2 fingers lightly between my shoulder blades. Posture is highly important when you work, Asher, he said smoothly, turning back to the stove. Sit up straight. You will ruin your spine. I froze. The coffee mug stopped halfway to my mouth. My sleep-fogged brain practically screeched to a halt. The words echoed in my head. Posture is highly important. Sit up straight. You will ruin your spine. It was the exact phrasing. Word for absolute word. I slowly lowered the mug, turning my head to stare at Julian's broad back. A cold, creeping sense of horror mixed with wild suspicion started to bubble in my chest. No, impossible. Alpha Slayer 99 was a random internet stranger. Julian Brooks was an elite, unapproachable enigma who probably didn't even know what a web novel was. It was just a massive, terrifying coincidence, right? But as Julian casually flipped another pancake, humming a quiet, unfamiliar tune, I couldn't shake the sudden, frantic realization that maybe, just maybe, I was sharing a room with my biggest fan. The suspicion that Julian Brooks might be Alpha Slayer 99 gnawed at the back of my mind like a very persistent, very annoying rat. I spent the entire morning side-eyeing him. Every time he picked up his phone, I squinted, trying to read the reflection in his ridiculous designer sunglasses. Nothing. The man was a fortress of secrets. By 2:00 p.m., my brain was too tired to care about cyberstalking enigmas. It was time for advanced macroeconomic philosophy. Let me be clear, I am a salted fish by choice, not by lack of ability. I learned early on that being visibly smart just means people expect you to do things. Doing things requires energy. Therefore, acting like a chronically exhausted, aggressively average student was a survival tactic. I dragged myself into the massive, tiered lecture hall and immediately slumped into a seat in the back row. Julian annoyingly sat right next to me, radiating that crisp, authoritative pine scent. Our Excel contract didn't technically mandate sitting together in class, but apparently, maintaining the illusion of constant companionship was part of his master plan to deter his ex-girlfriends. Professor Harrington, a man whose favorite hobby seemed to be publicly humiliating freshmen, was already droning on about Keynesian economic models intersecting with utilitarian ethics. I lasted exactly 4 minutes before I put my hoodie up, crossed my arms, and let my eyes flutter shut. Mr. Hayes, a sharp, nasal voice pierced through my carefully constructed nap. I groaned internally. Since you find my lecture so incredibly soothing, Professor Harrington sneered, pacing at the front of the hall, perhaps you'd like to wake up and enlighten the class. How would you reconcile the moral hazard inherent in corporate bailouts with the utilitarian imperative to prevent mass unemployment, specifically using the Kaldor-Hicks efficiency criterion? The entire lecture hall, all 300 students, went dead silent. Heads swiveled toward the back row, next to me. I felt Julian shift slightly, his broad shoulders tensing. He leaned in, his voice a low, rough murmur against my ear. Do you want me to intercede? The fact that he thought I needed rescuing was incredibly insulting. I opened my eyes, let out a long, theatrical sigh, and slowly stood up. I didn't even bother pulling my hood down. Well, Professor, I started, my voice dripping with the kind of lazy apathy that usually drove professors insane. The premise of your question is fundamentally flawed. Harrington's face turned an ugly shade of magenta. Excuse me. You're assuming corporate bailouts are a necessary evil to prevent mass unemployment, I said, leaning casually against the desk. But under a strict Kaldor-Hicks framework, an outcome is only efficient if those who are made better off could theoretically compensate those who are made worse. The problem with modern bailouts is that the wealth transfer is entirely asymmetric. I didn't stop. I fired off terms without blinking. The moral hazard isn't just a byproduct, it's the intended feature of a rent-seeking oligarchy. If you apply a utilitarian lens, the aggregate suffering caused by long-term wage stagnation and inflation, which directly funds these bailouts, vastly outweighs the short-term shock of letting bloated, inefficient corporations fail. You don't need a bailout to save the workers, you need a targeted social safety net. Bailing out the corporation just socializes the losses while privatizing the gains. It fails both utilitarianism and Kaldor-Hicks. I paused, looking down at the professor, who was staring at me with his mouth slightly open, completely speechless. So, I concluded, dropping back into my seat with a heavy thud. Unless we're completely redefining basic economic philosophy just to protect Wall Street, the question itself is a paradox. Now, if you don't mind, I was in the middle of a very important REM cycle. For 5 seconds, you could hear a pin drop in that massive hall, and then, from the front row, some brave soul started clapping. Within moments, the entire room erupted into cheers and applause. Even Harrington looked too stunned to issue a detention. I just pulled my hood lower, aggressively ignoring the attention. Great. Now they're going to expect me to actually participate next week. What a disaster. I felt a heavy, burning stare boring into the side of my face. I slowly turned my head. Julian wasn't looking at the professor. He wasn't looking at his notebook. He was staring directly at me, the cool detached Microsoft Excel robot expression was completely gone. His dark eyes were wide and tense, and practically gleaming with a startling, predatory fascination. His scent, which usually hovered around a manageable simmer, suddenly spiked. It flooded the small space between us rich dark, and overwhelmingly possessive. It made the hairs on my arms stand up. What? I snapped defensively in a whisper. I read a book once. Stop looking at me like I am a fascinating lab rat. Julian didn't look away. He didn't even blink. He just slowly leaned back in his chair, a slow, incredibly dangerous smirk spreading across his lips. Not a lab rat, Asher, he murmured, his voice dropping an entire octave, vibrating with an intensity that made my breath hitch. Just unexpectedly brilliant. For the first time since I met Julian Brooks, my snarky, quick-witted brain completely blanked. My face felt suspiciously hot. I violently turned my attention back to the front of the room, staring blankly at the whiteboard. At 4:00 p.m., per the spreadsheet, we were supposed to do the library handhold. When we sat down at the quiet oak table, I dutifully shoved my hand toward him, expecting the usual, stiff 5-second grip. Instead, Julian's large hand engulfed mine. He didn't just hold it. He shifted his grip, intertwining his long fingers perfectly with mine, pressing our palms flush together. His thumb slowly, deliberately stroked the sensitive skin at the back of my hand. I practically jumped, my heart hammering against my ribs. What are you doing? I hissed, trying to pull away. The spreadsheet doesn't say interlock fingers. That is an unapproved modification. Julian didn't let go. His grip tightened just enough to keep me anchored. He didn't look at his textbook. He looked right at me, his dark eyes simmering with that same intense fascination from the lecture hall. I have decided, Julian whispered, leaning in so close I could feel the heat of his breath against my cheek, that the current parameters of the contract are insufficient. Consider this an executive override. I stared at him, my heart doing a frantic, terrified little tap dance in my chest. Oh no. The enigma wasn't just acting anymore. And I had a terrible, sinking feeling that my lazy, salted fish days were officially over. For the next 48 hours, I lived in a constant state of low-grade panic. The executive override hand-holding incident in the library had fundamentally shifted the atmosphere in our dorm room. Julian was no longer just the robotic, emotionally unavailable enigma executing a spreadsheet. He was watching me constantly, with that same dark, terrifyingly fascinated expression he had when I publicly humiliated Professor Harrington. To cope with this new, highly stressful development, I retreated to my only safe haven, my web novel. It was Friday night. The dorm was quiet. Julian was sitting at his desk, flawlessly typing up some advanced engineering report, looking like a ridiculously handsome CEO in a tech startup commercial. I, on the other hand, was curled up in my computer chair like a goblin, wearing my oldest sweatpants, a giant bag of potato chips in my lap, and a massive glass of ice water precariously balanced next to my keyboard. I was in the zone. I was aggressively writing a chapter where the tyrannical Enigma villain gets dramatically rejected by the protagonist and falls into a mud puddle. It was petty, it was childish, and it was incredibly therapeutic. The Enigma's arrogance was finally his undoing. I muttered to myself, my fingers flying across the mechanical keys. He looked utterly pathetic, stripped of his perfectly tailored suits. I reached blindly for a potato chip. My knuckles hit solid glass. Time seemed to move in slow motion. I watched in absolute horror as the giant glass of ice water tipped over. A miniature tsunami cascaded directly across my laptop keyboard, splashing violently onto my stomach and soaking my sweatpants. No, I shrieked, shooting up from my chair. The laptop screen flickered menacingly. It sputtered, the backlight dimming as water seeped beneath the keys. Julian was out of his chair in a millisecond. He didn't even ask what happened. He just moved with that terrifying, predatory speed, practically teleporting across the room. "Step back," he ordered, his voice sharp and authoritative. He shoved me aside, grabbed the laptop, and immediately flipped it upside down into a tent position to drain the water. He yanked a towel from my bedpost, expertly drying the casing before his long, nimble fingers started pressing a specific sequence of emergency reboot keys. "Is it dead?" I panicked, hovering behind him, water dripping from my soaked shirt onto the carpet. "Julian, my life is on that hard drive. My soul is on that hard drive. If that motherboard fries, I have zero backups, none. I will literally cease to exist." "Calm down," Julian muttered. His eyes narrowed in intense concentration as he stared at the struggling, flickering screen. "The logic board hasn't shorted yet. I can salvage it, but I need to force a safe mode save. Go to the bathroom and change your clothes, Asher. You're dripping freezing water all over the floor, and you're shivering." "But my files." "I am currently bypassing the thermal sensors to save your data," Julian interrupted, his tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. "Go change now." I didn't argue, mostly because Julian in full Enigma command mode was genuinely intimidating, and partly because my soaked sweatpants were sticking to my legs in the most uncomfortable way possible. I grabbed a fresh set of clothes and bolted into the bathroom, slamming the door behind me. I stripped off the wet clothes, tossing them into the sink. I grabbed a towel and started furiously drying my hair, taking deep, shaky breaths. "Okay, it is fine," I told myself. "Julian is an engineering genius. He can fix a little water damage. The laptop will survive." I pulled my dry hoodie over my head. My heart rate started to slow down. I reached for the doorknob. And then, my brain completely froze. The realization hit me with the force of a high-speed freight train. When the water spilled, I hadn't closed my tabs. I hadn't minimized the windows. My web novel manuscript was open in full screen. The chapter title, "Why the Enigma Villain Deserves to Die Alone," was printed in massive bold, 18-point font. Worse than that, right next to the manuscript tab was my author dashboard. The one clearly displaying my pen name. The one showing the massive donation from Alpha Slayer 99. "Oh my god," I whispered, the color completely draining from my face. If Julian was trying to save my data, he had to look at the screen. If he looked at the screen, he saw the tabs. If he saw the tabs, he knew. He knew I was the author. He knew he was my top donator. And worst of all, he knew the pathetic, mud-covered villain in my story was a direct, unapologetic parody of him. I threw the bathroom door open and sprinted back into the dorm room, fully prepared to throw myself out the third-story window to escape the humiliation. But when I skidded to a halt in the middle of the room, everything was perfectly still. My laptop was sitting on my desk, completely dry closed, and turned off. Julian was sitting on the edge of his bed. He was perfectly relaxed, his long legs stretched out in front of him, his arms resting casually on his knees. But his aura was suffocating. The entire room smelled like a dense, burning pine forest. It was a thick, intoxicating cloud of pure, concentrated Enigma pheromones. It was the scent of absolute, undeniable victory. "Is it?" My voice cracked. I cleared my throat, forcing myself to stand perfectly still despite the fact that my knees were practically shaking. Is it broken? Julian stared at me. His dark eyes slowly dragged up my body, lingering on my face for an agonizingly long time. Then, the corner of his mouth curved upward into a slow, devastatingly handsome, and utterly terrifying smirk. It is perfectly fine, Asher, Julian said. His voice was a low, rumbling purr that sent a highly inappropriate shiver straight down my spine. The motherboard is intact. I made sure to carefully save and back up all of your creative endeavors. My heart plummeted into my stomach. You saved my files, I asked weakly. Every single word, Julian confirmed, his eyes practically glowing with dark amusement. He leaned forward slightly, resting his chin on his hand. You have a very vivid imagination, Asher. Your world building is spectacular, though. I must admit, I think the villain's character arc is about to take a very unexpected turn. I stopped breathing, he knew. He absolutely knew. I don't know what you're talking about, I lied, my voice painfully high-pitched. Julian just chuckled, a dark, vibrating sound that made my Omega instincts scream at me to surrender immediately. He stood up, towering over me, his presence completely filling the room. Get some sleep, author, Julian whispered, casually brushing past me. Tomorrow is a very busy day. I think it is time we update the Excel spreadsheet. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, staring at my closed laptop. The salted fish was officially caught in the net, and the fisherman had absolutely zero intention of letting me go. I woke up the next morning with the profound, devastating realization that my life was over. I laid in bed staring at the ceiling, genuinely contemplating if I could fake a sudden, highly contagious illness and transfer to a university in Antarctica. But before I could solidify my escape plan, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon drifted across the room, attacking my weak, lazy resolve. I groaned, dragging myself out of bed and shuffling toward my desk. Sitting directly on top of my closed laptop was a newly printed, crisp white piece of paper. It was titled Fake Dating Itinerary Version 2.0, The Sweetheart's Patch. My blood ran cold. I picked it up, my eyes scanning the heavily modified, color-coded columns. Section 3, Clause A, Morning Departure. The standard 3-second eye contact has been upgraded to 1 mandatory forehead kiss. Section 4, Clause B, Public Dining. The 5-second handhold has been replaced. Julian Brooks will maintain an arm around Asher Hayes' waist for a minimum duration of 5 minutes. Section 7, Clause C, General Campus Navigation. Fingers must be fully interlocked at all times while walking between buildings. Are you out of your mind? I shrieked, spinning around to face the kitchenette. Julian was calmly flipping bacon in a pan, already dressed in a dark, perfectly fitted turtleneck that made his broad shoulders look illegally good. He didn't even flinch at my yelling. Good morning to you too, Asher, he said smoothly, sliding the bacon onto a plate. I trust you have reviewed the mandatory software update. This isn't an update. It is a complete rewrite of the terms of service. I marched over, waving the paper in his face. A forehead kiss. 5 minutes of waist holding. I didn't sign up for this. This is a gross abuse of power. I veto this entire document. Julian calmly set the spatula down. He turned to face me, leaning back against the counter and crossing his arms. His dark eyes locked onto mine, practically dancing with smug amusement. Read the fine print at the bottom of the page, Asher, he murmured. I glared at him, aggressively flipping the paper over. At the very bottom in tiny, size 8 font, it read, the developer, Julian Brooks, reserves the right to push mandatory updates to the relationship parameters at any time. Refusal to install the update will trigger the immediate activation of the penalty clause. You're evil, I breathed, horrified. You are corrupt, tyrannical, megalomaniacal. I bought a fresh, industrial-sized bottle of lemon-scented bleach yesterday, Julian interrupted casually, inspecting his immaculate fingernails. And the communal toilet down the hall looks particularly repulsive this week, but of course, if you would rather scrub that, then let me hold your hand. He let the threat hang in the air. I stared at him. I stared at the paper. I thought about the toilet. I thought about my delicate, lazy hands touching a sponge. I hate you, I spat, violently grabbing a piece of bacon from the plate and shoving it into my mouth. I hate you so much it physically hurts. I know, Julian smirked, reaching out to casually brush a crumb off my cheek. His touch lingered just a second too long, sending a treacherous jolt of electricity down my neck. Drink your coffee. We have a forehead kiss scheduled in 20 minutes. Executing the new itinerary was nothing short of psychological warfare. At 10:00 a.m., we were standing outside the science building. The courtyard was packed. According to the new Clause 3A, it was time for the departure routine. I stood there, stiff as a board, glaring at the pavement. Just get it over with, I muttered. Julian stepped into my personal space. The scent of sharp pine and burning embers enveloped me instantly, thick and heavy. He didn't just lean down. He reached out, his large hands gently cupping my face. His thumbs lightly brushed my cheekbones. My breath hitched, my eyes flying up to meet his. He was looking at me with an expression so soft, so terrifyingly tender, that my brain completely short-circuited. He leaned down, and his lips pressed firmly against my forehead. It wasn't a quick, obligatory peck, it was warm, lingering, and incredibly deliberate. By the time he pulled away, my face was burning with the intensity of 1,000 suns. I couldn't formulate a single sarcastic remark. I just stood there, completely dumbfounded, as Julian gave me a devastatingly handsome smile. "See you at lunch, darling," he murmured, before turning and walking to his class. I spent the next 2 hours staring blankly at a whiteboard, my heart doing frantic, embarrassing backflips in my chest. My biology was completely betraying my logic. That night, the warfare continued on a different front. I was sitting at my desk, aggressively trying to write the next chapter of my web novel. I needed to punish the Enigma villain. I needed him to suffer. I typed out a scene where the villain gets pushed into a swamp. I read it over. It felt hollow. I deleted it. I tried to write a scene where the protagonist slaps the villain. But every time I pictured the Enigma's face, all I could feel was the phantom warmth of Julian's lips on my forehead and his hands on my waist. My stupid, traitorous fingers started typing a scene where the villain gently pulls the protagonist into an embrace instead. I gasped, deleting the paragraph in sheer horror. What is wrong with me? A loud ping echoed in the quiet room. I glanced at my author dashboard. A private message from Alpha Slayer 99. I slowly turned my head. Across the room, Julian was lying in bed, his phone in his hands, his face illuminated by the screen. He looked completely relaxed. I turned back to my laptop and opened the message. The message from Alpha Slayer 99 read, "The update is unusually late tonight, author. Is everything all right? I have been thinking. Perhaps the Enigma villain isn't so bad. Perhaps he acts controlling because he is utterly fascinated by the protagonist, but doesn't know how else to keep him close. Have you considered letting the villain win? Just a little. A forehead kiss might be a nice touch for the next chapter." I stared at the glowing screen. My jaw practically hit the keyboard. He was taunting me. He was literally sitting 10 feet away, typing out his master plan, and paying me money to read it. I aggressively hammered the keys to reply. My response to Alpha Slayer 99, the villain is a manipulative sociopath who uses spreadsheets to trap innocent, tired people. He doesn't deserve a forehead kiss. He deserves to fall into a volcano. Almost instantly, Julian's phone buzzed across the room. I watched him read it, a slow, dark chuckle rumbled in his chest, breaking the silence of the dorm. The screen pinged again. Alpha Slayer 99 replied, "A volcano seems a bit harsh. But be careful, author. The harder the protagonist fights, the more the Enigma is going to enjoy the chase. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's itinerary is quite full." I slammed my laptop shut, burying my burning face in my hands. The Enigma wasn't just rewriting my novel. He was rewriting me. And the most terrifying part was, I wasn't sure I wanted him to stop. If there was a specific circle of hell dedicated solely to my suffering, it would look exactly like the Delta Kappa fraternity house on a Friday night. It was deafeningly loud. The air was thick with the suffocating smell of cheap vodka stale sweat, and a chaotic, aggressive mixture of alpha and omega pheromones. The bass from the speakers was vibrating so hard it was actively rearranging my internal organs. I was only here because Section 5, Clause B, Social Integration, dictated that we had to make a joint appearance at one major campus event per month. Julian had gone to the makeshift bar to get us drinks, sealed bottles of water only, because he was incredibly paranoid about frat party punch. I was left sitting on a suspiciously sticky leather sofa in the corner, wearing my oversized hoodie and trying to make myself look as unapproachable as humanly possible. Well, look who it is. The strong, overbearing scent of cheap cologne and aggressively mediocre alpha pheromones assaulted my nose. I looked up. Standing over me was a guy whose name I didn't know, but he looked like an absolute Chad. He had the perfectly messy hair, the popped collar, and an ego that clearly required its own zip code. Chad plopped down on the sofa next to me, invading my personal space. Julian Brooks's little Omega pet. He left you all alone. I sighed, staring blankly at the wall. He left me for exactly 2 minutes, which was just enough time for my standards to plummet down to this conversation. Chad let out a grating laugh, leaning in closer. Come on. Brooks is a robot. A spreadsheet in human form. You need a real alpha. Someone who knows how to show an Omega a good time. Why don't you ditch the Ice King and come upstairs with me? I slowly turned my head to look at him. Every ounce of my exhausted, salted fish patience had completely evaporated. Look, Chad or Brad, or whatever generic lacrosse player name you have, I started, my voice dripping with icy apathy. I am going to save us both a lot of time. I leaned in, my eyes narrowing. I know you're currently failing Professor Miller's intro to political science because you paid a sophomore to write your midterm, and the idiot plagiarized an entire Wikipedia article. I also know that your beta girlfriend Sarah dumped you last Tuesday in front of the campus library because she caught you trying to hit on a freshman barista. And, frankly, your pheromones smell like expired body spray and deep-seated insecurity. The group of frat brothers lingering near our sofa suddenly went dead silent. Someone in the back let out a low, shocked whistle. Oh damn. Bro got absolutely destroyed. Chad's face turned an ugly, mottled shade of crimson. His pride was shattered, and his alpha ego couldn't handle being publicly humiliated by an Omega wearing sweatpants. Listen here, you little. Chad snarled, raising his hand to aggressively grab my wrist. He never made contact. Before Chad's fingers could even brush my sleeve, the temperature in the room seemed to violently plummet, only to immediately skyrocket into a suffocating, blistering heat. A scent swept through the room. It wasn't just a smell, it was a physical force. Dark, burning pine and molten embers. It was pure, unadulterated, predatory rage. It crashed over the crowd like a tidal wave, heavy and absolutely terrifying. The music was still blaring, but it felt like the entire party had stopped breathing. I looked up. Julian was standing 5 feet away. He had dropped the water bottles. He wasn't looking at Chad. He was looking at me, and then his gaze slowly swept over the crowd of alphas who had been staring at me in shock and newfound admiration. Julian's eyes were pitch black. His pupils were blown so wide there was barely a sliver of dark brown iris left. His chest was heaving with slow, heavy breaths. The software was gone. The Excel-loving, highly logical engineering student had completely vanished. This was primal. This was a territorial beast. Oh no, my brain practically screamed. He's in rut. Enigmas didn't just have normal ruts. They had cataclysmic biological events, usually triggered by extreme jealousy or a perceived threat to their chosen partner. And my little public display of brilliance had just flipped the kill switch. My own Omega biology betrayed me instantly. My knees went weak and a soft, embarrassing whine built up in the back of my throat, demanding submission to the overwhelming pressure of his pheromones. Julian took a single step forward. Chad stumbled backward, literally tripping over his own feet to get away, gasping for air under the crushing weight of the Enigma's aura. Julian didn't say a single word. He didn't even acknowledge Chad's pathetic existence. He marched straight up to me, reached down, and grabbed me around the waist. Before I could even formulate a thought, he hoisted me up and threw me over his broad shoulder like I weighed absolutely nothing. Julian, I yelped, my face instantly burning as my stomach hit his solid shoulder. Put me down. This is a direct violation of the Public Dignity Clause. Julian let out a sound. It wasn't a word. It was a deep, chest-rattling growl that vibrated straight through his body and into mine, making my toes curl. Contract void. His voice rasped out, sounding completely unrecognizable, dark, and dripping with possessive hunger. He turned and walked toward the exit. The crowd of terrified frat boys parted like the Red Sea. No one dared to speak. No one dared to even look him in the eye. I was bouncing on his shoulder, completely mortified, terrified, and yet completely intoxicated by his scent. As Julian kicked the heavy front doors open and stepped out into the freezing night, I squeezed my eyes shut. The salted fish was about to get eaten alive, and there wasn't a single spreadsheet in the world that could save me now. The journey back to our dorm was a blur of freezing night air and the terrifying, intoxicating heat radiating from Julian's body. I didn't dare speak. Every time I opened my mouth to complain, a low, warning rumble vibrated through his chest, effectively shutting me up. When we reached our room, Julian didn't bother using his hands. He literally kicked the heavy wooden door open, stepped inside, and kicked it shut behind us with a resounding slam that made me flinch. He finally set me down. My feet hit the carpet, and I immediately scrambled backward until my lower back hit the edge of my desk. The room was pitch black, save for the moonlight spilling through the window. Julian stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving. The heavy, suffocating scent of burning pine and molten embers filled every cubic inch of the space. It was dizzying. My omega instincts were screaming at me to bare my neck and surrender, but my stubborn, salted fish brain was desperately trying to cling to the last shreds of my dignity. "Julian," I started, my voice trembling slightly despite my best efforts to sound commanding. "You are experiencing a biochemical anomaly. I strongly suggest you take a cold shower before you do something that violates at least 14 clauses of our legal agreement." Julian didn't look at me. Instead, he took 2 long strides, bypassing me entirely, and opened my laptop on the desk. I blinked in confusion. "What are you doing?" The bright blue light of the screen illuminated his incredibly sharp features. His eyes were still pitch black, completely consumed by his rut, but his movements were terrifyingly precise. He opened the fake dating itinerary version 2.0 file. He didn't hesitate. He highlighted the entire spreadsheet. And then, he hit delete. "Hey," I yelped, my panic momentarily overriding my fear. "What are you doing?" "That's our legally binding document. If you delete that, the toilet scrubbing penalty becomes null and void." Julian slowly closed the laptop. He turned to face me, trapping me between the desk and his massive, imposing frame. He leaned in, placing one hand on the desk on either side of my hips. "I don't need a spreadsheet anymore," Julian murmured. His voice was a dark, gravelly rasp that sent a violent shiver straight down my spine. "And neither do you, author." My breath hitched. My heart completely stopped beating for a solid 3 seconds. "I have no idea what you're talking about," I squeaked, pressing myself as far back against the desk as humanly possible. Julian leaned in closer. The tip of his nose brushed against my jawline. "Don't lie to me, Asher. It is very rude to lie to your top donator. Especially after I specifically advised you that posture is highly important when you write." The floor completely dropped out from beneath me. "Alpha Slayer 99. You," I gasped, my face burning so hot I thought I might spontaneously combust. "You knew. You knew the whole time. You let me complain to you about you. You let me write chapters about throwing you into a volcano." "To be fair," Julian purred, his lips grazing the sensitive skin just below my ear, making me gasp. "I told you a volcano was a bit harsh, but you were so stubborn. A manipulative sociopath who uses spreadsheets to trap innocent, tired people. Isn't that what you called me?" "You are," I accused, though it sounded incredibly weak, mostly because my hands had somehow, traitorously, found their way to his broad shoulders, gripping his shirt to keep my knees from buckling. Julian pulled back just enough to look me in the eyes. The smug, teasing amusement was gone. The primal intensity of the Enigma rut was staring back at me, mixed with something so incredibly vulnerable and genuine that it made my chest ache. "I didn't know how else to get your attention, Asher," he confessed, his voice dropping to an agonizingly soft whisper. "You slept through every class. You ignored every alpha on campus. You looked at me like I was an inconvenience. The only way I could think of to keep you close was to give you a scenario where you didn't have to expend any energy. I cooked, I cleaned, I scheduled everything, just so you wouldn't have a reason to run away." I stared at him, completely speechless. The cold, calculating Enigma robot had basically just been a massive, desperate sim this entire time. "But I don't want to fake it anymore," Julian breathed, his dark eyes dropping to my lips. His thumb came up to gently trace my jawline. "I don't want a contract. I just want you. Tell me to stop, Asher. Tell me you still hate me, and I will step back right now. I swear it." He was trembling. The Enigma, completely consumed by a possessive, aggressive rut, was physically restraining his own biology just to give me a choice. My lazy, salted fish philosophy completely crumbled into dust. "If you step back right now," I whispered, my voice shaking as I slid my hands up to tangle in his soft dark hair, "I am charging you a massive penalty fee." Julian let out a ragged breath. A second later, his lips crashed onto mine. It wasn't a gentle, scheduled forehead kiss. It was hungry, desperate, and utterly consuming. The heat of his mouth, the overwhelming scent of his pheromones, the bruising grip of his hands on my waist. It was a sensory overload that completely rewired my brain. I melted against him, letting out a soft, pathetic sound that he immediately swallowed. He walked me backward until the back of my knees hit the mattress. We tumbled onto the bed in a tangle of limbs. "Mine," Julian growled against my lips, his hands frantically pushing my hoodie off my shoulders. Yeah, you big dramatic spreadsheet. I breathed, tilting my head back as his lips trailed down my neck. When his teeth finally grazed my scent gland, a sharp, electric jolt of pure pleasure shot through my entire body. He bit down, claiming me completely. The enigma mark sealed into my skin, tying us together in a way no Excel formula ever could. Author's note, posted 4 days later. Dear readers, there will be no update this week. The author is currently indisposed due to the sudden, highly aggressive process of moving his belongings onto the male lead side of the dorm room. Also, I need to issue a formal correction regarding the enigma villain. He is not, in fact, a perverted sociopath. He is just extremely clingy, highly proficient at making pancakes, and very, very good at biting. The enemies to lovers tag has been officially changed to shameless fluff. Thank you for your patience. I hit publish and closed the laptop with a satisfied sigh. The afternoon sun was warm. I was lying lazily on the manicured grass of the campus quad, or rather, I was lying with my head resting comfortably on Julian Brooks's lap. He was reading an advanced engineering textbook, looking as effortlessly cool and intimidating as ever. But his left hand was absent-mindedly playing with my hair, his thumb occasionally brushing over the fresh, healing bite mark on my neck. You're smiling, Julian murmured, not looking up from his book. Did you kill me off in your story? No, I hummed, reaching up to pop a piece of a sliced apple, which he had peeled and cut for me, into my mouth. I gave you a redemption arc. You should be grateful. Julian finally looked down, that familiar, devastating smirk playing on his lips. He leaned over, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead. I am, he whispered. I closed my eyes, settling deeper into his lap. My life was officially ruined. I was marked by the most terrifying enigma on campus. My secret author identity was compromised, and I had lost my supreme independence. But as Julian's warm hand slipped perfectly into mine, our fingers interlocking without a single spreadsheet telling us to do so, I realized that being caught in the net wasn't so bad after all. Actually, it was exactly where this salted fish wanted to stay.